If you think medieval knights were all mud, blood, and bad dental work, the Knights Templar would like a word. They started as armed guardians for pilgrims in the Holy Land, then somehow morphed into one of the richest, most feared institutions in Europe. Not bad for a brotherhood that took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which is a hilarious joke when you later see the vaults. By the 13th century, kings were borrowing from them. Churches were feeding them donations, and pilgrims were trusting them with their money like they were the original armored bank app. The order was founded around 1119, after the First Crusade had carved out fragile Christian states in the eastern Mediterranean. Jerusalem was dangerous, the roads were worse, and pilgrims heading to holy sites needed protection from bandits, raiders, and the general medieval enthusiasm for stabbing strangers. The Templars, officially the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, began as a small military religious order with a serious branding problem and a very useful job. They lived under a rule shaped by Bernard of Clairvaux, who helped sell the idea that a monk could also be a warrior without immediately setting off every alarm bell in Christendom. At first, they were not rich. They were supposed to be poor. That was the whole point. But medieval Europe had a talent for turning holy ideals into cash flow. Nobles donated land, money, and privileges to the order for spiritual merit and political convenience. Kings gave them estates. Bishops gave them favors. Ordinary believers gave them gifts, hoping the Templars would pray for their souls and maybe keep them from spending eternity in the bad neighborhood. The order built a network of commanderies across Europe and the Levant, and that network became its real superpower. It was not just a military order anymore. It was a transnational machine. And here is where the story gets deliciously ugly. The Templars learned how to move money across long distances with a level of trust that made them indispensable. A pilgrim could deposit funds in one place and withdraw them in another. A noble could send wealth without hauling a wagon full of silver through roads crawling with thieves. In an age when a strong lock was basically a prayer with hardware, the Templars offered security, record-keeping, and reach. They were not the only people handling credit in medieval Europe, but they became one of the most powerful. Their houses in Paris, London, and elsewhere were not just monasteries with swords. They were financial hubs, and the people running them knew exactly how much leverage that gave them. Their wealth came from everywhere. Donations poured in from the devout. Estates produced rents and crops. Trade and banking services expanded their influence. Papal privileges protected them from local interference. They answered to the Pope, not to kings, which was fantastic if you were a Templar and deeply irritating if you were a monarch who hated being told no. The order's exemption from taxes and many secular obligations made them even more attractive to donors and even more annoying to rulers. Nothing says holy institution quite like a balance sheet that makes a king start sweating through his velvet. By the late 13th century, the Templars had become a familiar part of European power. Their white mantles with the red cross were recognizable from Acre to Paris. Their discipline was famous. Their reputation was formidable. They were not flashy knights in the tournament sense. They were harder than that, colder than that, and far more organized. They were the kind of men who could pray, fight, and audit your estate without changing expression. That combination made them useful, respected, and, eventually, terrifying. But wealth changes the room. It changes the tone. It changes the way people smile at you while quietly measuring the knife. The Templars had become too rich to ignore, too independent to control, and too useful to attack openly. Kings still needed them. Pilgrims still trusted them. Churches still benefited from their gifts. Yet every donation, every estate, every deposit, every privilege added another brick to a fortress built on suspicion. The order that began as guardians of pilgrims had become Europe's most feared financial power, and the men who once protected the faithful now sat on a mountain of assets that made secular rulers look like amateurs with crowns. Philip's debts would soon turn sacred allies into prey. Philip IV of France did not wake up one morning and decide to become a villain in a velvet robe. He arrived there the old-fashioned way, through war, debt, and the kind of financial panic that makes a king start looking at sacred institutions like they are a spare wallet with legs. By the early 14th century, his reign had become a long, expensive grind. He had fought the English, squeezed the Flemish, and dragged France through campaigns that burned money faster than a monastery candle in a windstorm. The crown was deep in debt, and Philip kept reaching for the same ugly solution: debase the currency, call it reform, and hope the kingdom did not notice the trick. Spoiler: the kingdom noticed. Prices lurched, confidence cracked, and every merchant in Paris could smell the rot. Philip was not a flamboyant monster. That would have been too easy. He was cold, controlled, and stubborn enough to make a stone wall look flexible. Chroniclers remembered him as handsome in a severe way, with a pale face and a fixed expression that suggested he had already decided you were part of the problem. He ruled like a man who believed the crown should not ask permission from anyone, least of all the church. That attitude had already brought him into conflict with Pope Boniface VIII, and although Boniface was dead by 1307, the memory of that fight still hung over the French court like smoke after a fire. Philip had learned a useful lesson from that clash. If you wanted to crush an enemy, it helped to wrap the blade in holy language. The Templars were perfect for that kind of operation. They were rich, independent, and unpopular in exactly the right circles. They had houses across France, a disciplined hierarchy, and a reputation that had shifted from heroic to suspicious in the public imagination. They were also, crucially, not under Philip's thumb. That alone was enough to make them dangerous in the eyes of a king who treated autonomy like a personal insult. Add the crown's debts, the failed currency manipulations, and the constant need for cash, and the order began to look less like a sacred brotherhood and more like a very well-guarded pile of assets. Philip did not move alone. He needed papal cover, and he found it in Pope Clement V, a French pope who had every reason to avoid a direct collision with the King of France. Clement was not sitting on the throne of Peter in Rome like some marble statue of certainty. He was politically exposed, dependent, and painfully aware that Philip could make life miserable for him. So when accusations against the Templars began to circulate, the machinery of power started to hum. Heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, obscene rites, denial of Christ, all the usual medieval nightmare fuel, suddenly appeared in the record with suspicious convenience. Some of the charges came from confessions extracted under torture. That detail matters, because torture has a way of turning truth into whatever the interrogator wants it to be. Medieval justice, as ever, was a charming little circus with knives. Then came the trap. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, Philip struck. Across France, royal officers arrested Templars in a coordinated sweep. The timing was not accidental, and the scale was not small. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, was seized in Paris along with many of his brethren. The order's houses were raided, its members taken into custody, its reputation dragged into the mud before it had time to put on boots. If you were a Templar that morning, the day probably began with prayer and ended with chains. That is one way to ruin a Friday. The arrests were swift because they had to be. Philip understood that hesitation would give the order time to scatter, hide assets, or appeal to the Pope before the king could lock the doors. Instead, he moved first and explained later, which is often how power behaves when it knows it can get away with it. The charges were read out as if they had been waiting in the wings for years. The public was told that the Templars had betrayed Christ from within. The crown presented itself not as a debtor with a grudge, but as a righteous purifier of the realm. That is the oldest trick in politics. Call your financial emergency a moral emergency and watch people clap because they are afraid to ask questions. The irony was thick enough to spread on bread. The same monarchy that had benefited from the Templar services now treated them like a nest of vipers. The same church that had once protected the order now stood in a dangerous half-light, trying to survive between royal pressure and institutional embarrassment. Clement V hesitated, negotiated, and issued orders that reflected not certainty but fear. He could not simply defend the Templars without provoking Philip. He could not simply abandon them without admitting that papal authority could be bent like cheap metal. So the process dragged on, ugly and public, with confessions, investigations, and political theater all mixed together in one medieval stew. And the people watched. Some believed the charges. Some did not. Some probably just wanted to know who would be taxed next. In a kingdom where money had been mangled, trust was already on life support. Philip's move against the Templars was not only an attack on an order. It was a demonstration that no institution, however sacred, was safe if it stood between the crown and solvency. The king had turned debt into doctrine and suspicion into policy. The result was a purge dressed up as justice, and the whole thing had the sour smell of a deal made in the dark. Jacques de Molay would not go quietly. He was no courtly ornament, no soft-handed cleric. He was a soldier of the order, a man forged in the hard, declining world of the Crusades, and he understood that the Templars were being sacrificed on the altar of royal necessity. But for the moment, the king had the upper hand. The arrests had landed. The accusations had spread. The machinery of repression was moving, and once it started, it did not care much about innocence. It cared about obedience. Molay's fire would leave a curse hanging over France. The confessions came next, and they came the medieval way, which is to say with pain, pressure, and a complete absence of anything resembling due process. Under interrogation, some Templars admitted to denying Christ, spitting on the cross, and other charges that fit the crown's script far too neatly to smell clean. Whether those words were spoken freely or dragged out of men who had already learned what a rack could do to a human body is exactly the kind of question power prefers you not ask too loudly. Philip wanted a confession, not a debate. He got confessions, and then he got the ugly little miracle of a state pretending that torture was truth with better lighting. Pope Clement V was trapped in the middle, which is a terrible place to be when a king has your debt, your politics, and your reputation by the throat. He ordered investigations, then more investigations, then more hesitation, as if paperwork might somehow save the papacy from looking weak. It did not. In 1308 and 1309, the process dragged on across France and beyond, with ecclesiastical commissions hearing testimony, re-examining accusations, and discovering that once fear gets into the room, it tends to sit down and stay a while. Some Templars recanted. Some stood by their innocence. Some were broken. Some were simply trying to survive the week. Medieval institutions loved to call this justice. It was more like a slow-motion collapse with incense. Then came the endgame. In 1312, Clement suppressed the Order of the Temple at the Council of Vienne, not because the evidence had produced a clean verdict, but because the political pressure had become unbearable. The order was not formally condemned as heretical in the neat, courtroom sense Philip had wanted, but it was dissolved anyway. That is how power often works when it cannot prove its case. It changes the rules, changes the labels, and calls the wreckage a solution. The Templars were stripped of their future, their houses, their purpose. Their legend survived. Their institution did not. History has always had a taste for that kind of irony. Jacques de Molay remained in custody for years, a living reminder that the crown had not finished feeding the fire. On March 18, 1314, in Paris, he was brought before a public sentence of perpetual imprisonment. Another Templar, Geoffrey de Charny, was condemned beside him. Then Molay and Charny reportedly protested their innocence and rejected the confessions that had been extracted under pressure. That was the moment Philip's patience snapped. The king ordered them handed over as relapsed heretics, which was the legal costume worn by a political execution. By evening, both men were burned on an island in the Seine near the Isle aux Juifs. No grand battlefield, no heroic charge. Just smoke, rope, and the state doing what it does best when cornered by its own lies. Molay's death became the kind of story that refuses to stay buried. Later tradition claimed that, from the flames, he summoned Philip and Clement to answer before God within the year. The exact wording belongs to legend, not secure record, but the larger fact is plain enough. Clement V died on April 20th, 1314. Philip IV died on November 29th, 1314. The timing fed the rumor mill for centuries, because people love a neat curse almost as much as they love a scandal. And honestly, who could blame them? When a king destroys an order to cover a debt, and a pope lets the machinery grind on until the bones are showing, the public tends to suspect that heaven has noticed. Philip did not live to enjoy any lasting victory. The Templars were gone, but the crown's financial sickness was not cured by burning men in Paris. Clement did not save papal authority by yielding to royal pressure. He only proved how fragile it had become. The whole affair exposed a rotten seam in medieval power, where money, faith, and law were stitched together with thread that could snap under strain. The monarchy needed cash. The papacy needed room to breathe. The order stood in the way, and so it was crushed. That is the part people still recognize today, even if they do not know the names. Institutions under stress do not always reform. Sometimes they lash out, accuse, confiscate, and light the match. And that is why the Templars still haunt the imagination. Not because they were perfect. They were not. Not because they were innocent saints in white cloaks. They were not that either. They were men of war, wealth, discipline, and ambition, and they lived in a world that rewarded all three until it suddenly did not. Their destruction was a warning written in ash. Debt can bend kingdoms. Fear can bend churches. And when institutions begin to collapse, they often reach first for the nearest scapegoat and the hottest fire. History remembers who burned and who was burned.